They were tormented by their Babylonian captors. And one of the things that the Judeans respond is, how can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? Perhaps what's going on here is that their understanding, even in the 6th century BCE, is that the God of Israel only works when they're in the land of Israel. And that when they're on alien soil, God either can't hear or God is not powerful. But there seems to be a suggestion anyway that we haven't yet reached, which we will in the next century, this idea of there being one God for all the world, that is powerful all over the world, that can hear people's prayers all over the world, and that is the one God for all the peoples in the world. So we see stages in development of Israelite theology. Again, we have a switch in the power politics of the region. Babylon goes down and Persia comes up. The Persians, under King Cyrus II, conquer Babylon in 539, and they allow the Judeans to return to what is now called Yehud. The way to say Jew in Hebrew is Yehudi. Someone who comes from Yehud, right, from Judea, is a Judean, or in English we now say a Jew. Right? We think of Judaism as a religion, but it was certainly attached intrinsically to this geography of place in the land of Israel, Judah. The Judeans who return, which is only about 10% of the exiled population to Babylonia, they engage in the rebuilding of the temple. This now becomes the Second Temple, which was dedicated in 516. So 516 is when they dedicated it, 586 is when it was destroyed. There was a 70-year span when the temple didn't exist. Keep that 70 years in mind. We will come back to it 70 years after the Second Temple is destroyed. It's a preview of coming attractions. The next major movement in Israelite history is when Alexander the Great conquers the ancient Near East, goes very, very, very far east. Alexander the Great, he brings Hellenism. He was a student, legend has it, of Aristotle, and he brings Hellenistic culture, philosophy, literature, drama into the regions under his occupation, the empire that he has conquered. Upon his death, that kingdom of Alexander the Great was divided into 3 parts. And the land of Israel was controlled initially by the Ptolemies of Egypt. And the Ptolemies of Egypt, they encouraged Hellenism, but they didn't aggressively push Hellenism, so that those people living in Judea who wanted to maintain their ancestral ways, their ancestral religions, could do so without harassment, without interference. That changed in the year 200, when the land of Israel changed hands from the Ptolemies from Egypt to the Seleucids of Syria. And the Seleucids began spreading Hellenistic ideas and philosophy and religion more aggressively throughout the land of Israel. This is where the history might become a little more familiar to some of you, because around the year 168, we have the first war for religious freedom recorded in history. And that was initiated by Judah and his sons, the Maccabees, right? Otherwise known as the Hasmoneans. The name Maccabee, by the way, means hammer in Hebrew, and that might be why they got their name, because they hammered the Syrians. Or it might be an acronym for a verse that we have in Exodus chapter 15 that says, Mi kamocha be'elim Adonai. If you take the first letters of those 4 words, Mi kamocha be'elim, and then Adonai begins with a yud or the Y, that spells out Maccabee. And what do those 4 words mean? Who is like you, O Lord, amongst the gods, or amongst the mighty, is how it's traditionally translated. And that may have been what the Maccabees put on their shields as they went to war against the Syrian Greeks, or the Syrian Seleucids. So we're not sure exactly what Maccabees refers to. This war that we celebrate today as the holiday of Hanukkah was certainly a war against the Hellenism of the Syrian Greeks. But you also have to remember that it was a civil war. It was a civil war between those Jews who were less Hellenized and those Jews who were more Hellenized. And the Maccabees represent tradition, the customs of the ancestors, their Right? They were Hellenized to a degree, but they didn't want to become as Hellenized as many other people in the land of Israel did, who thought, great, we can be cosmopolitan, we can be like Alexander the Great. Why maintain these particularistic distinctions? Let's join the world culture of Hellenism. Let's stop engaging in traditional Jewish law. Let's stop circumcising our kids. Let's stop this allegiance to the Torah, and let's become good Hellenistic citizens. Right? That was too much for the Maccabees and a whole group of more traditional conservative with a small c, Jews that really went to war against those more Hellenizing elements. The reign of the Hasmoneans expanded the territory of the kingdom of Israel, but the dynasty quickly became corrupt. About 100 years later, there was struggle between two brothers within the Hasmonean dynasty, and one brother actually invited Rome, that was now the new power, right? The Greeks had been the power. Now Rome takes over as the great power. And one of the brothers invited Rome in to the land of Israel in 63 BCE. And once Rome had a toehold in the land, they slowly established control of the land. First, they had native-born rulers to represent them and to collect taxes. And finally, they appointed their own procurators in order to control the masses and collect taxes. One of the things that they're particularly interested in was the collection of taxes. At this point, things were bad for the people living in the land of Israel. Taxation was burdensome. They didn't have political freedom. They didn't have the religious freedom that they had experienced under the Hasmonean dynasty. And so apocalyptic visions of the end of time start to proliferate. And people begin suggesting, oh, maybe he's the one to fight the Romans and to kick them out of the land and to be the Messiah, right? We'll have a whole session on the Messiah, but the fundamental idea of the Messiah is the idea of a Jewish king related to King David who reestablishes Jewish political sovereignty for Jews in the land of Israel. So there began to be messianic speculation at this point, and finally, in the year 66, this tinderbox explodes, and we have what's called the Great Revolt from 66 to 70. The Great Revolt is started by Jewish zealots, sort of right-wing nationalists who believe that only Jews should be in political control of the land of Israel and of the temple. So they initiate the Great Revolt against the Romans. The occasion for the revolt was when the Roman procurator, Gessius Florus, expropriated gold from the temple treasury, which would only be used for holy things. And so this provided a pretext for the war. So although it took several years, the Great Revolt is eventually quashed, and the Second Temple is destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. According to rabbinic sources, rabbinic legend, one member who represents the accommodationist party in Judaism, the doves, the liberals, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, during the Great Revolt, before the temple is destroyed, he is spirited out of Jerusalem in a coffin by his disciples and is allowed by the Roman general who is prosecuting the war, to establish what becomes the seed of rabbinic Judaism, an academy of rabbinic sages at Yavne. Some scholars suggest this was really a POW camp for some of the people captured. We don't really know historically what Yavne was, but what the rabbinic sources tell us is that it was the seed of rabbinic Judaism founded by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. What happened to these zealots, by the way? The zealots that started the Great Revolt to begin with in 66, they managed to escape the old city before it was destroyed. And Josephus, who is a historian of this period, he started out as a Jewish soldier and then surrendered to Roman forces in the north of Israel and sort of bargained his way into a nice villa and pension in Rome. And he would agree to write the history of the Jews during this period, which he did, in Greek. He describes how sanguinary this revolt's end was, that blood was flowing through the streets of Israel. Blood was flowing through the streets of Jerusalem. At that point, the zealots figured out that the writing, the blood was on the wall. They managed to escape from Jerusalem, and they went up to one of the last king of Israel's mountain fortresses at Masada and were able to survive there until around the year 74, when the Romans finally succeeded in breaching the walls of Masada. There's a great mini-series that describes those events. The Jews on the mountain decided to commit suicide rather than to be captured and enslaved by the Romans. Okay, on one foot, as we say, that's the history of the Jews for about 2,000 years, from the patriarchs to the destruction of the Second Temple. Now what I want to do is outline what some of the Jewish sects were at the eve of the destruction of the Temple. One group that we know about from the New Testament and from Josephus, as well as from rabbinic literature, are the Sadducees. The Sadducees didn't have an oral tradition that interpreted the Torah that we have, the Pentateuch. Therefore, they denied resurrection of the dead because resurrection isn't mentioned at all in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. We have references to resurrection in later books, but because it doesn't appear in the Torah, the Sadducees rejected it. They also denied divine omniscience, since free will is a necessary assumption of the Torah. God lays out all kinds of laws and commands and says, choose life, choose to follow the commandments. That didn't make sense to the Sadducees if God knew ahead of time what the Jews were going to decide to do. The Sadducees were also connected with the aristocracy and the priesthood. They tended to be the more Hellenized members of society. Another group in Second Temple Judaism were called the Essenes, and the Essenes are widely associated with a group living around the Dead Sea and are held to be responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in 1947 by a little Bedouin boy. The Essenes were an ascetic community with an apocalyptic theology that was also dualistic. So they understood the world was coming to an end, and how would that world come to an end? The sons of light and the sons of darkness would battle each other, with the sons of light prevailing. The Essenes reject free will totally and claim that divine providence controls everything. Another group were early followers of Jesus. Outside the land of Israel, they're called Christians. Inside the land of Israel, they're called Nazarenes because Jesus lived for the majority of his life in Nazareth. They claimed that Jesus was the Messiah, although Jewish sovereignty had not yet been restored to Israel. Thus, there was the prophecy of an imminent second coming in order to fulfill those earlier expectations of what a Messiah would do. Outside the land of Israel, we have St. Paul, who is known as the apostle to the Gentiles, and he spreads the good news, the gospel, throughout the Roman Empire and was incredibly successful in doing so. The last group that really had the most Israelites at that time affectionate toward were the Pharisees. The Pharisees have gotten a terrible reputation, a tragic reputation, from the New Testament. But the Pharisees were the most popular group amongst all these groups before the temple was destroyed in the year 70. They claimed an oral tradition which interpreted the Torah. So unlike the Sadducees, the Pharisees believed in resurrection, and they also believed in the world to come, that people would get rewarded or punished in the next world upon death, depending on what their actions were in this world. The Pharisees promoted the priestly purity laws that were only obligatory for the priests as a way for all of Israel to attain holiness. They really were interested in democratizing Judaism, in taking the temple Judaism that's described in the Bible and making it accessible and obligatory for all of Israel. The Pharisees can be viewed as the spiritual descendants of the spiritual ancestors of the rabbis. Whenever the rabbis talk about a dispute between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, without exception, they always agree with the Pharisees. The oral tradition of the Pharisees becomes the oral Torah of the rabbis, so that by the time we get to our next lecture that talks about the value, the preeminent value of Talmud Torah, it's actually in 2 lectures, the oral traditions have become an oral Torah that have the same authority and the same origin as the written Torah. So that according to the rabbis, at Mount Sinai, God gave to Moses not just the written Torah that we have in the Pentateuch, but also the oral Torah that includes all of the interpretations for those parts of the Torah that aren't so clear or weren't included in any case. So we'll talk more about the oral Torah in the future.